all about textiles and apparel. So all I'm going to run through today is kind of current state of play. So let me just make sure that you're not showing, Mia, and it's me that's showing. So right, okay. So the current state of play, so what our understanding is of the sector currently, and then we're going to run through some of the challenges that the sector is facing, and particularly through a global lens. So we're going to focus on the bureaucracy and costs in global trade, particularly since Brexit, now that we're importing and exporting to the EU and from the EU. Some of the ideas around removing some of the friction from that UK-EU trade. We're going to look at the what we call a preferential trading landscape that the UK has in place now. So we have over 70 trade agreements in various different levels of ratification that have been signed with countries around the world, and another 70 what we call unilateral trade agreements, whereby we zero rate or reduce the import duty from certain countries that are classed as being developing countries to help them boost their industrialization strategy. We'll talk about accessing overseas labour and skills, because labour is a big issue for the sector at the moment, getting a hold of those people that can help boost our capacity. We'll talk about currency risk exposure. That's a big one in global trade. And we'll talk about, these last two are kind of linked, the changes that we're seeing in customer buying preferences, and that's linked to kind of like sustainability and that circular economy. We're starting to see the Generation Y and Z place an awful lot of importance on sustainability when deciding which brands to go with. And obviously, there's a lot of regulation either on the way or already implemented that is kind of like going to force the hands of some companies at some stage. And then I'll talk a little bit about the fully funded programme, which is a series of one-to-one support, peer support, and the whole lot. Will cover that off. So that after today's webinar, if you want to have a one-to-one with us and perhaps enlist our services to do some research for you, or some kind of, you know, whatever that might be, it'll be very specific to your organisation, then there is funding available to allow us to do that without you incurring any costs. So we'll cover that off at the end as well. So because there's just a couple of us, I'm just going to run through some of these slides. So in terms of the makeup of the sector, you know, retailers make up the predominant share, and I'm not sure at this point, because we haven't really had a discussion as to where you guys are coming from, whether you sit within manufacturing or retailing, but it's a sizable sector that means an awful lot to the UK economy. You know, it employs more than 64,000 people, and it's made up predominantly of what we call micro businesses, so under 10 employees. There's a total of just over 34,000 businesses in the textile sector currently. But it's a sector that's facing a lot of change. It's a sector where we see quite a significant trade deficit, meaning that we import, I'm just letting somebody else in here, meaning that we import some 18.8 billion pounds more than we export. Now, that's probably due to the nature of our supply chains and so on, but it is one of the sectors where, you know, if you compared it to financial services, for example, whereby we export more financial services than we import, textiles is something that, a sector where we see a deficit. And I think, you know, not just COVID that kind of wrote 10 billion pounds off the kind of like sales of goods. So that was a big enough shock for companies in the sector. But then Brexit, it's kind of like a double whammy, really. So, you know, the aftershock of Brexit has seen a lot of UK manufacturers and sometimes retailers, in terms of looking for fulfillment centres over in the EU. They've started to think about relocating or moving their operations to the EU to try and overcome some of the logistics and staffing and manufacturing issues that they've encountered. Just letting somebody else in, forgive me. And you know, there was a survey done by Retail X Fashion Sector that actually gave percentages. So 25% of those that had been interviewed said that they would consider relocating entirely. Some 39% said they would move to the EU if they were offered some kind of tax advantage. And 91% said that they would take advantage of a visa scheme if it was offered. Again, just kind of like showing us the levels of talent and skill shortage and issue that the sector is facing. But then there's a whole load of other things that Brexit has thrown in our way as well. So we've got the case of double duties, because the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement doesn't work the same way as free movement of goods, sorry. So say you were importing goods from China, you would pay import duties when the goods come into the UK, because there's no bilateral trade agreement with China currently. And then when you export them to the EU, unless you've processed them some way in the UK, your EU customer then pays that third country duty as well. Now we'll talk about how you can overcome that sometimes on one of the later slides. But that double duty scenario is a big one, and it's made us, if we bring goods in from overseas via the UK and simply ship them out to the EU without any processing, it's made us less competitive because obviously of that double duty. We've seen a large number of, and I'd be interested to know if you guys have experienced this as well, cancelled orders as a result of Brexit and as a result of kind of like the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement bedding in. Those customs controls and customs declarations have increased costs significantly. So, we're hearing a lot about that. And then, of course, we've had the increased freight costs as a result of COVID, which are still, astronomically high. And you've got to make that decision. Do you absorb that cost and impact your margin, or do you offset it to the customer? And it's been a really, really challenging time. But then we've had supply chain disruption through COVID and so on as well. And then this change or shift in consumer buying preferences. So there's an awful lot going on at the moment that companies in this sector have got to grapple with and get their heads around. But I just thought, like we said at the very beginning, we'll go through some of these, and I'll share with you some things that you can do, some of which you might have thought about, some of which might not have occurred to you, and we can help you with all of it essentially. So in terms of the bureaucracy and increasing costs, particularly if we think about trading with the EU, because historically, trading with the EU has been as easy as trading with another city in the UK. We've been local companies towards each other, and now we're actually third countries. We're a third country in the eyes of the EU, and the EU is a third country in the eyes of the UK. And that's very different to free circulation of goods that we all enjoyed previously. So I think there's a couple of things. There's, make sure that your cost efficiencies in transport are being realized. So, where possible, if you can increase the volume, say you're importing goods or exporting goods, if you can increase the volume and move away from air freight, which is astronomically expensive, towards groupage loads on containers, for example. You don't have to purchase in container loads. You can share transport with other traders. Are there, do you have relationships with other companies in the sector that you can start trying to find some synergy in your buying, so that you can share space in containers or groupage loads? Consider sourcing from alternative overseas markets. So I'll talk a little bit about China in a bit, but China used to be one of the go-to markets, and China's actually positioned itself now as being responsible for some 19% of global supply across multiple sectors. So obviously when COVID happened and China's supply chains fell down, our supply chains fell down as well. So a lot of companies are starting to think outside of China and start to source other suppliers in the likes of Myanmar, which obviously is subject to EU trade sanctions at the moment, but the UK hasn't implemented those currently. But Myanmar, Vietnam, Pakistan and so on. And those because those countries are emerging countries, we don't typically charge import duty on the goods that we receive from those countries. So there's a cost saving there, whereas pretty much everything that we import from China is subject to third country duty. Look at duty deferment accounts and imports. So if you are importing, you can obtain what's called a duty deferment account that allows you to defer any import duty and pay HMRC that 30 days later. Now, if you have your own duty deferment account, you are not using the clearance agent's duty deferment account, which they'll typically charge you a facilities fee for, anywhere between 3 and 5%. Some of them cap it so it doesn't get too high, but that's another cost saving. Postponed VAT accounting. So any VAT registered business importing in the UK will have to pay import VAT. Just letting somebody else, will have to pay import VAT on the goods that they import, but you don't have to lay out that cost to clear the goods. You can have it deferred against your VAT account, which means that you retrieve a monthly statement from HMRC telling you how much import VAT you've incurred in that month, and depending on your revenue, you might do your VAT returns every quarter, or you might do them every month, and that's when you account for that VAT, and it kind of cancels itself out as VAT does. So there's a couple of things to help with cash flow and working capital. And then customs special procedures, kind of like the jewel in the crown that so many UK importers aren't aware of, is if you are importing goods and you're there's a whole raft of them, but if I talked about one, which would be inward processing, for example, if you're bringing in raw material or fabrics or whatever into the UK to go towards producing a different finished article, so an item of clothing, for example, then you can suspend any import duty and VAT while you're doing that processing. Now, if those goods are subsequently re-exported, so therefore your export markets, then that import duty and VAT is never payable. It just gets written off. And similarly, if you're selling those goods on the UK market, it's at the time when you've finished manufacturing the goods that you pay that import duty or VAT, and it's on the finished goods rather than on the raw materials. So that's just one example of customs procedures that HMRC offer. There's no cost for being authorized for that, it's just applying. And it's just ways of kind of like limiting cost, limiting the impact on cash flow and so on. And it's really important that we spread the word, particularly in sectors where margins are being really constricted, so that we find every opportunity to save costs. Inward processing and other customs procedures are things that we apply for on behalf of clients all the time as part of the programme that we're doing for the East Midlands Growth Hubs. The other thing is explore multi-currency accounts. So, we've seen a very weak pound probably since we made the decision to leave the EU. Now, a weak pound is great for exporters. It makes us, very competitive in our destination markets. But it's not so good for importers. So exporters will typically invoice in GBP, in sterling, but importers are typically invoiced in the source country's currency, which leaves them exposed to those fluctuations and has a big impact on margins. So explore multi-currency accounts. So, that way you can decide when to send, when to spend money at that optimum rate, rather than when it's dictated to you, so to speak. Look at third-party financing options that can help cash flow and working capital. So the likes of Booby Financial Services and UK Export Finance, which is a government driven body, they offer invoice financing, for example, whereby if you accept a large invoice, you accept a large order from an overseas client, and you're kind of dependent on that money coming in order to, get the order ready. So you need to purchase raw materials and so on. You're dependent on recognizing that invoice revenue sooner, but you've maybe, to be competitive and win the deal, you've offered extended credit to that client overseas. the likes of Bibby Financial Services and UK Export Finance will step in at that point, and they will pay the invoice immediately, and they will recoup the funds from your customer. Now, there's a small charge to pay. Nothing is free in this world, but it can be the difference between you kind of having the working capital to deliver an order for a customer and actually having to turn it down because you just can't finance it. And the other thing is, you know, look at that product positioning in the market, consider whether there's any elasticity in your UK and export market pricing. All of the research that's been done recently around, you know, those Generation Y and Z demographics suggests that for sustainable linked brands or brands that they feel share their sustainability values, they're willing to pay an uplift in price. So that would suggest that there is the opportunity to actually offset some of these increased costs through bringing more sustainability into the business to the customer, because they're willing to pay that premium for something that they see to be sharing their values, and not just a case of greenwashing, which we've seen a lot in the textile sector over the last few years. So that's just a way of kind of like looking at bureaucracy and costs and things that you might like to think about. In terms of removing that friction from UK and EU trade, it's a tricky one. We're kind of, what are we, 2.5 years into this new way of working with the EU. And I think it's placed an awful lot of burden on you guys as what we call importer of record or exporter of record. You're kind of like the legally responsible entity for making sure that your imports are declared correctly and your exports are declared correctly. There's lots of support out there. We provide training, for example, as part of this program to help you understand, you know, what is required of you, make sure that you're compliant with overseas regulation and HMRC regulation. So there's a lot of support out there, but it's really important now. You're not just a local company to other companies in the EU. We are exporters and importers, and that carries a certain level of liability and responsibility with it. Incoterms, something if you've only ever traded in the EU, you've never had to worry about before. But now we have to use Incoterms. And for those of you unaware, they are, there's 11 of them in total, and they're kind of 3-letter acronyms. We love our 3-letter acronyms in international trade that denote essentially who bears responsibility between the buyer, so the importer, and the seller, say the exporter. And it determines who pays for transport, who pays for insurance, who has to clear the goods when they arrive in the UK, who's responsible for doing the export declaration in the source country. And it's really important that we use the correct Incoterms. So if any of you on the call are unsure of what they are or how they impact you, let's book a call and we can go through them and make sure that you're compliant from that perspective. Become really familiar with the import and export declaration. It's essentially the same document. It's what we call a C88, or a single administrative document, a SAD document for those of us in the know. And it is quite sad when you're filling them out, but hopefully it's an agent that you have working on your behalf. But become familiar, and again, that stuff we can help you with in terms of what fields are filled out, because you are ultimately responsible. Even if you're using an agent, they'll work for you in what's called a direct capacity, a direct representation capacity, meaning that so long as they have carried out your instructions to the letter of the word, they bear no liability for an incorrect declaration. So become familiar with what fields are completed on an export declaration and which ones are an import declaration. Nobody's asking you to do it, but just become familiar so that you can actually check their work and make sure that they're representing you correctly. The UK tariff and the EU common external tariff. So before Brexit, we all used the same tariff, which is basically a list of all of the commodities that you can possibly think of in terms of goods that we ship globally. And because we were part of the EU, we applied the same import duty on everything that came into the customs territory, the 28 member states. But since leaving the EU, we now have a separate trade tariff, which has allowed the UK government to what we call liberalise certain tariffs. So they might have reduced the import duty on certain tariffs, or they might have zero rated it. They haven't done any of that for textiles. Textiles is still a big revenue generator for HMRC. Unfortunately, the import duties are some of the highest that we see across the tariff. But become familiar with the duties that are being applied. And again, we can go through this on a one-to-one kind of like a practical call, share my screen, show you where to look. Be familiar with the import duties that are applied to the products that you're bringing in. And similarly, when you're determining your export pricing for the EU and making sure that you're competitive in the EU, you understand the duties that will be applied on import into the EU. So you need to become familiar with that, certainly for scheduling your export pricing, making sure that you're remaining competitive, because that's big focus of what we have to do now. It's become more troublesome to deal with us. And so now we have to make it easier for those EU consumers and businesses to buy from us. Understand the process for importing and exporting your goods. Textiles are all what we call standard goods. Typically, there's no non-standard goods. When I talk about non-standard goods, we're usually talking about food products where there's tight regulation, or products of animal origin or live animals, some plants, wood products. They're non-standard goods, but you guys are probably just in the standard goods category, but there are still requirements. So if you're exporting, you still need to issue a commercial invoice to your customer. You still need to issue a packing list, and you still need to have that export declaration to move goods into the EU. And flip it round the other way, in order to clear goods coming into the UK from the EU, you still have to have those three documents. So you'd have an import declaration, your commercial invoice from your supplier in the EU, and also your packing list. Okay, so just be aware of the documentation requirements, and if there's any special import or export controls, which there shouldn't be in your sector. Capitalize on all those lovely special procedures. So, you know, that inward processing one that I mentioned earlier. If you think it can help alleviate that cash flow burden, or even that cost, if you're subsequently exporting finished goods, then why wouldn't you get authorization for it? It's a cost saving. And then I think, you know, we need to start framing, and it's really hard in a sector where margins have been, you know, really stretched, but I think we have to frame the argument away from cost and talk about value. We have to reiterate the value of UK manufactured goods. We have to position ourselves as being on top of the whole sustainability agenda, which I appreciate is a whole raft of work on its own, but that's the direction of travel. And I think those of us who are reluctant to get on board with that are going to lose out long term. We're just not going to be able to trade, you know. And I'm mindful that the textile sector, with the majority made up of UK micro businesses, so, you know, under 10 employees, we make up really, really important small cogs in large supply chains. But it's those larger companies that are being forced by regulation to change their practices. And if those smaller companies in their supply chain can't keep up, they will be dropped. So sustainability is something that concerns me personally for clients across all of the sectors that we deal with, because it is coming, it's very real, and it will impact, I think, SMEs far more than it will the larger corporates who have access to more resource, more funds, more reserves to get ready for this, and it isn't such a burden on their capacity and on their funds. So again, via one-to-one, we can cover all of this in more detail if at all important. You know, I referred earlier to these trade agreements that the UK has got around the world. So I've listed them here. This doesn't include the trade agreements that those unilateral trade agreements that we have as part of the UK's GSP system, or we call it Generalised System of Preference system. That's those almost 70 countries that we say, we know you're developing, we want to help you boost your exports, therefore we'll make you competitive in our domestic market by eliminating the import duty. So it makes their products cheaper here in the UK, and they can compete effectively with other international products or domestically manufactured products. So that's outside of this slide here. But these are the ones that the UK government has kind of signed post-Brexit. So they're in various different states, full ratification, meaning it's all been signed and all sealed. Some of them are provisional application, meaning they haven't been signed, but they're still in force. So if you were to look, if I was to show you the UK trade tariff, you'd see that for these countries, typically for your goods, they'd be 0 rated in terms of import duty. And then there's a whole host of them that are being in the process of being negotiated at the moment, and the government's going out to consultation with businesses and other government bodies on signing up other ones. So that's trade agreement consultations. But it's really important that we understand how trade agreements work. So we've been so used to trading with the EU, and it's all been free circulation of goods. If something's imported into the UK, it can be circulated throughout the other 27 member states without any customs controls, any border controls, any duty, any VAT, and so on. Very different with a trade agreement. So a trade agreement is typically bilateral. So both sides sign up to the same terms, if you like. If you look at the UK and EU trade agreement, we've got this situation at the moment whereby it's now a preferential trade agreement, which means that the duty that's charged on import is all determined by the origin of the goods. And this is where it gets tricky with textiles, because we import from all over the world. And unless we're doing enough processing of all those raw materials here in the UK, then we don't do enough to be able to say these goods are UK origin goods now. So they're maintained, say they're Chinese origin. So when they're exported to the EU, if we haven't done enough to say now they're UK origin goods, and there's a lot of terms and so on that determine what makes a UK origin goods, and we can go through that, then they're exported to the EU and they will face third country duty because they haven't changed their origin from Chinese through their process of passing through the UK. Now, there are certain things that you can do if you're not doing sufficient processing in the UK to say you're bringing in fabric from China, you're manufacturing a garment in the UK, instantly, pretty much, that garment would be of UK origin and would enter into the EU duty-free. However, if you're just basically bringing in goods from, hold on just one second, I do apologise. Bear with me 1 second. You can never prepare for all eventualities on calls like this. I do apologise. There are things that you can do. So if you were just simply bringing in goods from China, and you were just maybe unpacking them and repacking them and packaging them and sending them off to the EU, there is the notion of what's called a customs warehouse, where technically you bring the goods into that customs warehouse and they're not cleared for free circulation in the UK, so that duty and VAT isn't payable, which means that they can be subsequently exported to the EU without you avoid that double duty scenario. So the EU customer will still pay the import duty because the goods have come from China, but then you haven't got that double duty scenario. It's quite a complex system to talk through on a call like this, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but if you just think about with the EU trade agreement now, and any trade agreement that the UK has around the world, the duty is determined by the origin of the goods. Okay, so I don't want to confuse matters too much more by going into too much detail on that. But I did want to talk about building resilience into supply chains, into global supply chains particularly. So Gartner has this really good, and when we're working with clients, we're talking about resilience in supply chains. I love to use this this model because it makes sure that clients have considered all of the important aspects when they're thinking about resilience in their supply chain. So the first one starts with risk appetite, and risk appetites are unique to each company. You know, different companies will be able to absorb different levels of risk, but it can be massively impacted or influenced by your market position and your profitability, and also the product and service that you're offering, or maybe the certain competitive situation that you're in. And I just think assessing the risk that is in your supply chain can help you prioritize changes that you might need to make. So, you know, can you continue sourcing from a supplier who is providing no traceability on their goods, you know, back to the source of their goods, when you're faced with increased regulatory burden in the UK and in the EU? You know, is that feasible? So that represents a risk, really, still continue to source from that manufacturer, that supplier. But remember as well that you can be subject to somebody else's risk analysis. So somebody, you know, one of your customers could be conducting the same exercise and flag you as a risk because perhaps you can't provide the full traceability on the goods. So you have to think about it from a kind of you're a supplier, and also from your supplier's perspective. And then I think critical partners is another really good one to consider as well. So do you have critical partners in your supply chain? You know, are you overly dependent on one or two suppliers? And if they're weakened by adverse trading conditions, do they have ability to diversify? Can they build resilience into their supply chain? And I think if you understand the kind of resilience levels of your critical partners, then that helps make a decision as to whether you reduce dependency on them by sourcing from another supplier as well, technically balancing that risk, or do you look entirely for different capable partners? But thinking about, you know, where the balance of risk is amongst critical partners is important. Then thinking about what is it that you're actually protecting. You know, when you're making a decision, first determine what you're trying to protect. Is it a product line? Is it a government contract? Is it market access? What is it? What's critical to your business? And then once you consider what you're trying to protect, you can think about sole sourcing risks, increased labor costs, tariffs, lead times, all those regulatory burdens as well. And then the answer to all of those questions gives you the notion of how much resilience and diversification you really need to build into your supply network. But then there's going to be trade-off decisions as well. So, you know, it's often less expensive and time consuming to establish resilience right at the very beginning when you're setting up a new product or you're going into a new market, for example. Diversifying an existing network is much harder to execute, and it can take up a significant amount of time. So sometimes you might have to think, well, actually, you know what, I'm just going to leave things the way they are at the minute because the balance is I don't have time to invest in it and the risk isn't as great. But then there might be other occasions where you're thinking, well, actually, I really do need to pursue this diversification for this new product line or something because the risk is too great. And then you have to think about who's going to pay for it. So if you're starting to change suppliers, that might have an impact on cost. It might have an impact on, you know, not just the cost of goods, but the cost of transport and duties and everything wrapped into it. Who's going to pay for you building more resilience into your supply chain? You know, can you absorb the cost yourself? Can you share them with upstream suppliers? Can you raise prices for customers? But also always keep in mind the fact that the cost of not investing in resilience can be massive. Just like I said before with China, when COVID happened, all of our supply chains kind of like, you know, just fell apart. And so the cost was massive of not having more resilience in our supply chain. And then think about those national or trading block policies or incentives. Now, there's not an awful lot coming from UK government at the moment, but what I'm referring to there is that US lawmakers are considering investments of tens of billions of dollars in America's semiconductor industry over the next 5 to 10 years, because they want to bring back semiconductor manufacturing to the US to reduce resilience on China predominantly. And China's been investing in manufacturing clusters and automation and digital technology for years. So there's got to be a government directive to boost a certain sector and to reshore activity. Not seeing an awful lot coming from the UK government as of yet, but I think they're still just so wrapped up in the whole aftermath of Brexit that, you know, nobody's really seeing things straight. So yeah, I don't want to go into too much more detail on that. It's all about thinking, you know, if one supplier fell over tomorrow, do I have an alternative? And also thinking about the regulatory direction of travel. You know, am I going to be forced to switch suppliers at some point because they're not going to be compliant, and as such, they're not going to help me remain compliant? Accessing overseas labour and skills, again, we can talk about this offline, but I think so many companies are not taking advantage of the what we call the sponsorship, sponsoring immigration now. So, you know, we lost a lot of very good talent when we left the EU. There was an awful lot of very skilled people went home, and an awful lot of lower skilled labour, which is equally as important to our economy. They went home too. So, you know, some sectors have got no succession planning. It's all a little bit of a mess. But there is the sponsorship scheme for bringing individuals in from overseas. And I think sometimes, because there's a cost associated with it, some companies think it's just, you know, beyond me. It's actually not. You know, to be able to get a license to bring in what we call workers or temporary workers, a company can be authorised or have that sponsorship label for a £1,500 investment, and that is renewed every 4 years. And then there's a small fee when you actually bring that individual into the UK. So they have to be given what we call a certificate of sponsorship, and there's a small fee attached to that. But I think it's worth exploring. It's really worth exploring when we have this talent and labour shortage here in the UK. We can't. The UK apprenticeship schemes are starting to build traction, but not to the level that we need. So why aren't we looking back to overseas? And yes, there's a charge attached to it, whereas before there wouldn't have been. But again, balancing that up, it may well be worth looking into in more detail. Currency risk exposure, not going to talk too much about this because I'm very mindful of time. But again, I mentioned earlier that, exporters make hay while the sun shines when we have a weak pound, but for importers, it can be really, really hard. And not forgetting that a lot of our exporters are importers as well. So it kind of balances out, really. There are a couple of hedge funding kind of options that I want to discuss with you. We've got forward contracts and market orders. And the difference between those two is basically forward contracts is you agree to purchase currency at a certain rate, and that rate is usually maintained for 2 years. It's like a fixed rate interest on your mortgage. So you can plan effectively. You know, if you know when you're going to be bringing in supplies, you know that you've got that fixed rate. Now that can work to your advantage or not your advantage. So when it's more favourable conditions, you're still stuck at that kind of like low exchange rate, but also it protects you against if the exchange rate goes in the other way. Market orders are kind of like slightly different. They don't dictate when in the future you actually buy that currency, but you can determine kind of like a banding for the currency. So, you'll only ever have this low exchange rate and you'll only ever have that high exchange rate. So it's just, again, it's just a level of certainty, and it's just a level of protecting yourself against a volatile currency market. And then I think I mentioned earlier, operate through other accounts. A lot of the world still trade in US dollars. So a US dollar account might be good, so that you can determine when you exchange that money, when the exchange rate is looking good. And, it can differ quite significantly day by day. Have a euro account, for example. But exchange rate fluctuation and protecting against currency risk are always things that I say, speak to a specialist. If you don't have anybody in your network, then drop me a line and I can make a good few recommendations. I've worked with a number of them now over the years. Adapting to changing customer buying preferences. This is a whole big topic, to be honest, but we are seeing that outside of cost, overwhelmingly sustainability is what's driving customer buying preferences. And again, I keep citing that Gen Y and that Gen Z demographic, but they are our consumers of today and tomorrow. They've got a lot of working years ahead of them. So they've got to have that disposable income, and we need to make sure that we're aligning our brands with their values. And I think sometimes we get so het up on thinking about sustainability as being just environment. Sustainability isn't. It's got that social aspect as well. And remembering with textiles, there might be certain things that without a big macro shift or a big government push, you can't influence. But what can you do on the social side of things that promotes your company as taking seriously your ESG or your environmental, social governance? So there's things like, the social aspects, health and safety, fair salaries, workplace diversity and inclusion, employee well-being, community engagement. All of those things tie into your position as being a sustainable company. So it doesn't have to be all about the environment. If you think about textiles, it's known to be one of the largest sectors contributing to those global carbon emissions. And that's, some of it we can barely get away from. We've got lengthy supply chains, you've got energy intensive production methods, but this sector does contribute to between 8 and 10% of global carbon emissions. It has a kind of negative, what's the word I'm looking for, reputation in that respect. So anything that you can do that, that's within your power to address that is always good. And that's where we talk about materiality assessments, and we can talk about that in a one-to-one, but it's basically engaging your customers, your employees, everybody that sits within your community to talk about what's important to them from an environmental and social perspective and governance perspective. And then you look at what you can feasibly do as a business to address some of these things that are important to your stakeholders. And I've put the UN Sustainable Development Goals there because they're a fantastic framework of 17 goals that, even if you just pick 2 or 3 of those to focus on as a business, you're making a change. And you think about the whole, the level of SMEs that make up the global economy. We are overwhelmingly the backbone of the global economy, not just the UK economy. If we all made just those little changes, the impact would be absolutely massive. And the important thing is, it's important to your customers, it's important to your community. But this is a whole other section. We're doing a webinar on it, I think 2 weeks from today as well, all about that sustainability piece. But we can talk about it in a one-to-one as well after this. But it's a way of remaining relevant to your customers that are prioritizing sustainability, even though you can't impact much of the environmental piece right now, because that takes a big industry shift, it takes a big government shift across the board, and you can't always influence that. I just want to finish on talking about the linked legislation, because at the moment sustainability has been a bit carrot and stick, a lot of carrot. There's a lot of stick coming down the line now. One of the most controversial pieces of legislation that's come before UK Parliament last year was about the retained EU law bill, which is kind of called what the Tories call the Brexit Freedoms Bill. But that was set to basically revoke a lot of EU regulation. So it's that, freeing ourselves from the shackles of the EU as it's been described. We'd been told that actually that the environmental regulation would stay because it's stringent and it's important and it has a global impact. We're now seeing, as of an amendment that was made to the bill last week, that we're starting to deviate a little bit. Now, what impact that has on sectors across the UK, where, you know, if the UK seem to have deviated too far from EU regulation, does that put another barrier in place in terms of trading with the EU? We'll have to see. It's coming out in the wash. But one part of the regulation that I saw is going to be removed is the National Air Pollution Control Plan, which obviously was a big piece of regulation that the EU pushed to get through. And now we're basically saying we're going to either simplify it or move away from it. Big issue there. But there's other things coming up. So ESG and sustainability reporting. So over the last probably 3 to 5 years, we've seen a big impact on corporates of the amount of disclosure and reporting that they've had to do around their environmental impact. So we've seen a huge push in financial services, and now, you know, banks and insurance companies are having to comply with a raft of regulation that enables consumers to understand fully the sustainability related features of an investment product or a banking product, for example. We're going to see that across different sectors as well. And we're going to see it, I think personally, filter down to SMEs, whether they're impacted by the supply chain. So because one of your buyers has to report, then you have to report because you have to provide data to feed into their report. But I think also at a certain point down the line, it's going to be, well, corporates report on this, why can't SMEs? So I think it's a case of what do you need to be doing now? And I think it's a case of identifying the data that you should be maintaining and start maintaining it now for the point at which it becomes pertinent from either a buyer or a supplier, or when the regulation filters down to the SME level. We've also seen the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, so a rather lofty ambition to make textiles more durable, repairable, reusable and recyclable, and to tackle that fast fashion and textile waste. I was shocked actually to read that textiles, in terms of textiles, is only 1% recycled, which really shocked me actually. But this EU strategy is aiming to address that. Now, it's already started to drive the agenda in the EU. So the question is, what's it going to do for UK companies that are trading with the EU? To what level are we going to have to comply? And again, we can discuss that in more detail separately. EU digital product passports, they're coming. So they're designed, that transparency piece that I talked about before. These digital passports or digital product passports are aimed to provide that transparency to kind of share that product information across the entire value chain. So data on raw material extraction, production, recycling, and so on. And the EU is the first large regulator. Others will follow suit. So I think it's, what can you do from your perspective today? It comes down to that data again. Identify the gaps in the data. So in your supply chain, you know, do you have that full traceability? If you don't, where are the gaps and how do you overcome those gaps? So start collecting that missing data, and start becoming familiar with those kind of ESG reports and life cycle assessments and so on. And again, we've got a ton of information we can share with you around that. Extended producer responsibility, that's a big one affecting lots of sectors, not just textiles, but it's the notion that the producer, and that is you guys as the exporter, for example, it impacts our exports predominantly into the EU at the moment because they're leading with this, but it will replicate around the world. It puts the burden of responsibility back on the exporter to pay for what is effectively the recycling of the packaging at this stage of the goods that they export. Very helpfully, the EU, no two member states are implementing the legislation in the same way. So there's different thresholds by which it will apply to you and so on. Again, we've got reports that we can share with you, but that's one to think about where it comes to packaging. If you are, you know, exporting goods to the EU and you're using certain types of packaging, then you will have to pay a contribution towards the recycling of that packaging moving forward. And actually France, Germany and Spain, actually France and Spain, sorry, there's no thresholds. It's just if you're exporting, you have to pay this contribution. So that really needs to be, that the whole idea is that it's trying to change companies' attitudes towards packaging. You know, they'd rather resource alternative or research alternative packaging materials than pay for the other one, than pay this contribution. The other one I'll point out, because I'm really, really conscious of time, is the UK chemical strategy is going to be announced. It should have been now, but it's been postponed to the end of the year. It'll set out how we're going to regulate chemicals going forward now that we're outside of the EU. So for me, I was thinking, well, how is that going to impact those chemicals that are used for fabric finishes like crease resistant, anti-static, easy care, and so on, and what impact might it have on dyeing as well? So lots going on. Again, we'll share these slides with you together with the recording. And then just moving on to the support, I'd like to just finish this slide by just saying, look, just get in touch, and whatever your requirement is, whether it be your lack of knowledge, or you've got a particular challenge or a particular ambition, then all of this support that we're funded to provide on behalf of the East Midlands Growth Hub, it's all client-led. So we've got this framework. We can do sustainable trade planning, we can do trade compliance reviews, we can do you know, our global manager program, but ultimately it's driven by you guys. It's driven by what is most important to you. So if you've got a challenge or an ambition linked to international trade, then just get in touch and we can support you with that. And as you can see, for some clients, they've received up to 30 hours of support from ourselves. We're very, very hands-on. We don't just tell you to do it and go away. We'll do it side by side with you, or do it for you and explain how we did it. It's all about that knowledge transfer, making sure that you become more self-sufficient with global trade moving forward. How you take advantage of this? For the free support, you've got to be in Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, and you've got you can sign up to one-to-ones via our website or via Eventbrite. You can just drop us a line to internationalisation@globaltrade.com, or you can give us a call. But you might not be, I'm not sure where all of you are joining from today, so if you're outside of those areas, don't worry. We don't charge for picking up the phone and having a chat and signposting and pointing in the best direction. So you can just get in touch with us at contact@globaltrade.com, or you can book a one-to-one discussion by Zoom. So if you're not in the East Midlands, don't stress about it. We're still here to support you. We know it's a bit of a rubbish time at the moment. And then my details are here. But I'm going to share these slides with you anyway. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing,